The Last Airbender is a movie that has real trouble with combat magic. Actually, let me start that again. The Last Airbender is a movie that has trouble with consistent cause and effect in its magic system, and that makes the combat swing between actually pretty decent and downright ludicrous. Yeah, that's right. Stick around, I'm actually going to say something nice about The Last Airbender, even though it's illegal on the internet. Also, spoilers. My name is Bearup, and on this channel we mainly talk about screen combat and all of the myriad things you can do with it, because by gosh, I love theatrical violence, and apparently so do all of you. And the thing is, on screen you can fight with your fists or swords or staffs or whatever, but you can also fight with magic. And The Last Airbender contains some useful examples of how and how not to do that. For the uninitiated, Avatar: The Last Airbender was an animated Nickelodeon show which ran for 3 seasons. The story follows Aang and his friends as they seek to save the world from the Fire Nation's conquering frenzy. Aang is not only the last Airbender, he's also the Avatar, the only person in the world who can manipulate fire, earth, air, and water. And he's got to learn to bend water, earth, and fire so he can defeat the Fire Lord and save the world. It's a really, really good series. I have a video about The Last Agni Kai from the 3rd season in which I talk about why that fight specifically is so good, and a couple of older videos which are more like character studies on Zuko and Aang, but the series and the way they set up water, earth, air, and firebending in particular was pretty darned impressive. One of the reasons for that was that it used real-world martial arts as a basis for each of the 4 bending styles. To wit, Tai Chi, Hung Gar Kung Fu, mostly, Northern Shaolin Kung Fu, again mostly, and Bagua. In 2010, the live-action adaptation directed by M. Night Shyamalan came out, adapting the 1st season of the show, Book 1 Water, to film, and it was not well received? Let's go with not well received. Very quickly, the plot of the film goeth thusly. Katara and Sokka, whatever, find Aang, or Ong, in the ice at the South Pole. They discover he's the Avatar. Ooh. Aang has to get to the North Pole and learn waterbending. The Fire Nation is trying to stop that happening, including the Fire Lord's banished son Zuko. At the end there's a big battle at the North Pole. Aang symbolically accepts his role as the Avatar, to be continued never because audiences were not impressed. Now, the bending styles of the series were carried over at least somewhat into the film. For example, there are some very lovely sequences of Katara and Aang doing their Tai Chi waterbending thing. I don't really know very much about Tai Chi, so I don't know how their form is, but you know, it looks pretty and flowing. However, there is a major problem with the bending in the movie, and it boils down to cause and effect, specifically proportionality and timeliness. The effort expended by characters to achieve certain results is inconsistent, and the time taken to perform bending moves makes them seem really ineffective for combat. Let me put that more simply. Too much of the time, there's too much bend and not nearly enough element. Pretty Tai Chi, but no water is moving anywhere near them. I mean, we could argue that one's a kata, but lots of staff waving, but not much air going anywhere. Lots of posturing, but the effect produced is And just to round things off with the most egregious example of dodgy filmmaking, too much bending, effect equals pebble? Side note, this is actually an editing problem. These dudes are the ones who put up this wall to save Earthbending Dad and his son. But what it looks like they're doing is all of this posturing and then a pebble lifts into the air. Now, if you keep watching, you'll see that the pebble is actually being controlled by this guy right here, but that's not the point. Chaps, you already made the wall. There was no need to continue going through the moveset because you're not actually doing anything right now. If, as the filmmaker, you wanted to signal to the audience that these guys were the ones who put up that earthbending wall, then what you do is you have Earthbending Dad look over to them and they do one more move. Obviously a finishing move for that moveset which they just did, which put up the earthbending wall. Great. I get editing problems, and we'll get to that in a bit because this scene is particularly bad for them, but this was just not necessary. Bending is supposed to be impressive. You have the power of the element in your hands. You have telekinesis, albeit of a very specific variety. You can make your element do the things, including fighty things. This impressive effect is somewhat lessened when it takes 10 seconds of hand swishing to do anything, during which time someone could have just run up and punched you in the face. I could give you an example of earthbending from the series, oops, I just did, where one move does one thing. One move. But the movie does get it right sometimes on the proportionality and timeliness front, just not consistently, and that's very frustrating to watch. For example, in this scene, our heroes arrive at the North Pole, and there are no fewer than 12 waterbenders standing in a line doing their Tai Chi thing. Why does this work? Proportionality and timeliness, or if you prefer, effort. 12 waterbenders performing synchronized movements for several moves in a row manage to lift this giant ice wall. As the audience, we buy this because we instinctively feel that a bigger thing will require more effort to move than a smaller thing. The bigger the thing, the more people you'll need to move it at all, and the longer it will take to get it where it needs to go. The effort definitely does not have to be directly proportional, especially if you're in a soft magic system like Avatar, but it does need to be reasonable. Yoda lifts the X-Wing out of the swamp in Empire Strikes Back. The ship is obviously a lot bigger than anything he could affect by natural means, but we buy it because the Force. We buy it because not only does the Force grant telekinetic power, it's also a Force multiplier. That wasn't even meant to be a pun. Never mind. I mean, it grants greater power than you could produce with your physical body. For a more martial example, Return of the Jedi has Luke in what is possibly an editing oopsie, or not, who even knows, kick the air while rescuing his friends on the sand barge, and has this dude react like he's been legit kicked in the face. Force kick! Why not? You can totally do that in a universe which contains telekinesis. No contact is made, but your intent combined with your force powers makes it happen. Sure. We'll buy that. In Revenge of the Sith, Count Dooku fights Anakin and Obi-Wan on General Grievous's ship. Dooku is force-choking Obi-Wan, which again is a telekinesis thing, and then Dooku kicks his leg back at Anakin. Anakin goes flying back into a wall. Telekinesis, force multiplication. Great. Or in The Last Jedi, Rey kicks 3 dudes with her 1 foot and they all fall backwards. Telekinesis, force multiplication. To bring it back to The Last Airbender, sorry, got distracted. We will buy that people with special powers moving their bodies in certain ways will bend the elements to their will. It's magic, no problem. But instinctively we still require cause and effect to be somewhat consistent. Even if the magic system contains a force multiplier, which bending the elements clearly does, and even if people have differing levels of power, which they do, we expect the effort necessary in terms of time taken or concentration level or level of physical exertion required to be at least somewhat consistent. We expect it to make some kind of intuitive sense. We also expect timeliness, with which the film has some problems. For an example of where The Last Airbender does this right, see Daddy Earthbender bringing up a wall to protect his son during the Earthbender jailbreak thing. Proportionality is solid, and that was also a pun. You know what? Never mind. Proportionality is appropriate. The wall is big enough to protect the kid, it's substantial, but it's not the size of a house, say. So we buy it. And timeliness is also fine. It's a combat situation. He needs to move fast or the kid is toast. There are just unintentional puns everywhere today, aren't there? Let's pretend that I meant them. Speed is really important in combat, and this is where the proportionality thing really tends to bite. I know I mentioned it already, but they already did the thing they needed to do, i.e. putting up the wall to protect earthbending dad and son. Having them continue to move without any earthbending seeming to happen on the screen is, at best, disorientating for your audience, and at worst, just hilarious in the non-good way. This also shows up in the fight between Zuko and Katara at the North Pole. Now, my opinions may be coloured by my knowing the series, but I thought at this point Katara was meant to be, like, good at waterbending? Yeah? In the series, when the moon is out, she has the upper hand, but as soon as the sun rises, Zuko has the edge.
You rise with the moon. I rise with the sun.
But here she's beaten because in his third set of moves against her, Zuko sends 2 fireballs from different directions and it takes her so long to block the first one that she completely misses the second one. This is a timeliness problem. The number of moves taken to block a fire blast goes from basically 1, reach behind you, bring your hands forward and the water appears in front of you, to wave your arms about, turn around and pull the water over your head, to wave your arms around and then pull the water up. Speed is really important in combat. That first single move would have blocked all 3 of these strikes. Why the extra moves? It just makes Katara look incompetent. If they decided that, okay, Katara was not going to be good at waterbending at this point, then fine. But very shortly thereafter, they have Katara save Aang from Zuko in a suitably impressive way, and Aang looks at her all impressed and stuff, and it just seems a bit inconsistent, really. The timeliness problem is down to the choreography, but not necessarily the choreographer. Because if someone higher up the food chain, say the director, I don't know, whoever, has decided that each element-related move should require multiple steps, then that's what's gonna happen. Maybe all of this hand-waving was the choreographer's idea, maybe not. But still, in a system which clearly has one move does one thing options, having them do all of this really overly complicated stuff just to block a fire blast makes them look incompetent. The other timeliness problem that you see is a special effects one. Kinda. The problem, which shows up most egregiously in the Earthbender breakout, is that the element isn't tied to the movement properly. You would intuitively expect the kick, the most powerful movement, to launch the fire, but No, the awkward hand movement afterwards does. This airbending move immediately shoots the dude up into the air. Great! This move comes a second or two after the movement is complete. This one directly after it has the movement of the air tied to the movement of his hands perfectly again. And because they follow one after the other, it's really hard not to notice. But I know exactly why the timing of this is off, and probably so do you if you've watched this scene more than once. This is one shot and the effects are all added in later. We go from here. Yep, keep going. Keep going. Keep going right the way through. To here, and there are no cuts. Which means that every awkward moment, every mistimed piece of choreography or wire work is going to show up. On the surface, this is a special effects problem, but the special effects team can only work with what they've got. And so they have to time the movement of the air effects to the movement of the wire work, regardless of what Aang is doing with his hands. They have to make it work, and so sometimes the element is tied very precisely to the movements, and sometimes it's just not. That is still no excuse for the Earthbenders. You know what the worst part is though? The one shot thing, which works so poorly in the Earthbender breakout, can work beautifully, and does, in this very film. I really genuinely like this bit right here where Aang air and water bends his way through all of the Fire Nation soldiers to get to the wall. For what, 10, 15, 20 seconds? We see what this film's fight scenes could have been, and it's painful because it just looks nice. And it has a point on like a character level and a plot level. Go with me here. The slide is perfect. A beautiful airbending avoidance and entirely in keeping with the character of the Aang of the series. He flips over the second guy's head and makes the ice collapse beneath him with waterbending. He saves a waterbender with some more waterbending as he lands. There's ice, there's water, there's acrobatics. It's gorgeous. There's slow motion, which enhances it rather than just making it look weird, and it's great. And then there's this air corridor thing, which is a bit off looking, but you know what, I really enjoyed that previous part. There's even a sensical point to it in terms of the story. Aang has spoken to the dragon spirit, show them the power of water. Really, could you be more vague than that? Spirits, honestly. The moon spirit is killed, and in a scene which contains both the worst and best lines of dialogue in the film, Yue gives herself up and the moon is restored. Zhao is killed and Aang makes a run for the city walls so the Avatar can show them the power of water. Which he does, without killing absolutely everyone, which is an interesting departure from the series. We don't know Aang's objective at the start of the scene, but we see his urgency. And when he gets to the wall, we see that was his aim. He says, I know what to do, and that is enough. The point of this scene is to show that Aang has accepted his role as the Avatar. The bowing ceremony thing is a callback, a bookend for that scene earlier in the film. But we see everything we need here in the way he flawlessly combines water and airbending. The Earthbender prison scene is messy and inexplicable. Like, guys, you're Earthbenders in a prison made of dirt. What are you doing? But this bit, this does everything it needs to. And even though it's a combat scene, there is a grace and an ease to it which the rest of the film really just kind of lacks. See? I told you I was going to say some nice things. Eventually. The Last Airbender's treatment of bending falls down because it's inconsistent. Some impressive things take 1 move, some impressive things take 5 moves, and characters inexplicably choose the 5-move thing in a situation where the 1-move thing would have been much more effective. But even that's not consistent because sometimes they choose to do the effective thing, and that inconsistency is intuitively baffling to the audience. And so it distracts us from the point of the scene, whatever that happens to be. I mean, I don't think a good grasp of the bending disciplines could have saved the movie. It has too many other problems, but the moments where they get it right just underscore all of those other moments where it just doesn't work.